Hi, everyone. My name's Jennifer Haddon, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland. Today, I wanted to respond to the theme of this week's dialogue and mobilizing ideas about the future of the climate movement and the things that the climate movement might do to be more effective. And today, I want to talk really about three different strands of the climate movement that I think are really interesting and worth paying attention to going forward. So, by way of background, I wrote a book about the international climate movement in 2015 called Networks in Contention. And the book mainly explored how international NGOs tried to influence the treaties that were being negotiated at that time, in particular, the Copenhagen Accord, which was concluded in 2009. So, for a long time, I think one of the main foci of the climate movement was these annual negotiations around the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, because global climate change is seen as a commons problem and we have to have a global treaty to address it, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things that has changed since the publication of that book in the sphere of climate governance is that we've seen a lot of emergence of kind of bottom up style initiatives in this area. This has even been codified in international agreements like the Paris Agreement or like the Lima to Paris Action Agenda, which has a bunch of contributions from non state actors contained in it. So I think as a result of this kind of bottom up governance approach taking hold in the international realm, this gives civil society actors more leeway and more potential targets, really, on which to focus their activism. So it makes domestic politics more important, it makes local politics make more important. And as a result of that, I think civil society is kind of retooled in some important ways. So, the first thing that I think is really interesting that's going on in the climate space is this whole campaign around the Green New Deal. So, the Green New Deal has a goal of reaching net zero carbon emissions by 2030. It's also pushing for just transition for workers, for employment for those who want it, working and changing our infrastructure, etc., in order to accommodate more sustainability in the United States. So I think that's a really interesting campaign. Like the Sunrise Movement is an organization that's been really strongly associated with the Green New Deal idea. And it seems to have been very successful in getting the name Green New Deal and a discussion of the Green New Deal off the ground. So one of the things I think that would be interesting to pay attention to there would be the coalitions that organizations like the Sunrise Movement and other green groups are able to form, because the whole idea of Green New Deal involves not only environment but also labor. So thinking about how social movements form coalitions, which is a topic on which there's been a lot written, but specifically whether or not they're able to form sort of enduring and impactful coalitions on this issue, I think would be a really interesting topic. And that would primarily be something that might interest sociologists or political scientists with a background in American politics. A second area that I think is really interesting is activism against fossil fuel projects in Asia. So while coal-fired power plants are basically not being built anymore in the United States, there's a huge number of coal-fired power plants that are still in the works globally. The majority of those, about 50% of them, are in China or India. And there are various stages of sort of permitting to actually in construction. We know that this is potentially harmful if all of these projects were to go forward. That would basically spell climate catastrophe. So, building on a lot of work that's been done in the domestic context around protest and siting, I think it'd be really interesting to explore how activism might affect the trajectories of these projects. One book that's kind of interesting in this regard is Doug McAdam and Hilary Boudet's book on putting protest in its place, which has kind of an interesting design to look at how activism emerges around risky energy projects in the United States. And I'm currently working on a project with some colleagues that tries to explore similar dynamics around coal-fired power plants globally. So I think, looking at those energy projects all over the world and looking at what's happening with them is going to be really important because they have a very direct impact on emissions. And the third thing that I think is really interesting to examine is, again, in the international space, but it concerns the way that we are going to compensate and to provide assistance for people who are going to be affected and impacted by climate change. One of the things that we know is that climate change is going to impact people unevenly, and it's going to impact the poor and the most vulnerable the most, despite the fact that historically those are the people who have the least responsibility for the rise in global greenhouse gas emissions. So organizations from the development space have become increasingly involved in international negotiations as a result of the fact that adaptation and loss and damage issues have become more prominent on the agenda as emissions have advanced over time. So I think following the trajectory of their advocacy, which is a little bit out of the scope of what I studied earlier, would be very interesting and intriguing. My colleague Jennifer Iris Allen and I wrote a piece on NGO campaigning on loss and damage, for example, which argued that framing the issue in terms of justice enhanced the advocacy strategies of NGOs working on that issue. But I think there's a lot more to be done there, especially since those conversations have progressed. So those are my thoughts. I'm really interested in hearing what other people contribute to this dialogue. And if you have any questions about this, please feel free to email me at my work or to tweet at me at jennifer.haddon. Thanks.